Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this very special professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. And today with us, we have a very timely topic and speaker. Our speaker is Kenneth C Davis. He is the author of More Deadly Than War, the Spanish Flu Pandemic of 1918. He's written a wide variety of books that I'll let him talk about as he sees fit. But I think today we're here to learn more about the Spanish flu of 1918 and the implications kind of in society, economics, and all sorts of stuff, definitely as it relates to World War I. A reminder to everybody, if you stick around to the end, I will have a contact hour certificate for you if you complete the survey. And again, that our speaker has asked you to please put any questions into the chat box and I will be moderating from there. So without any further ado, again, I'd like to welcome author and historian Kenneth C Davis.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. I was going to show you the mask of the day. I'll do it quickly here. I am in New York City, where masks are mandatory if we are going into a place where there's no social distancing. And so that was Thursday's mask for today, although I have not yet been outdoors today. Briefly, a lot of you are old friends. I know Maine well and have been to the Social Studies Conference twice, most recently last November. And yes, we were talking about the Spanish flu last November, and it seemed very interesting in a historical way, very interesting in that we should talk about this, but obviously no one in November could foresee where we are sitting here in our homes talking to each other on Zoom. I don't think I knew what Zoom was last November. Probably many of you didn't as well. But just for a brief introduction of myself and what I do and my approach to history, most people know me for this book. Don't know much about history, everything you need to know about American history but never learned, which I am astonished and shocked and flabbergasted to say came out 30 years ago. It's just not even believable to me at some point that I've been doing this for 30 years and loving every minute of it. Don't know much about history was written in a question and answer format. If you're not familiar with the book, it is not a textbook. It was not even designed for students. It was really designed for adults who had gone through history class and either never learned it all wrong, or forgot what they learned. So it's basically walking through 500 years of American history, everything from who really discovered America to how did America elect its first African-American president and what is Obamacare. And sometimes in there, the questions were a little offbeat and quirky, like why is there a statue of Benedict Arnold's boot? And did Columbus's men really bring syphilis back to Europe? Those are the kind of questions I like to ask and have fun with because I think that history should be fun. History was always fun to me growing up as a kid. And I do really believe that I became a historian when my parents would take us and throw us in the back of the car with some old World War II Army surplus tents and sleeping bags, and we'd go off to places like Gettysburg and Valley Forge and Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. And so from a very, very early age, I had the sense that history wasn't just something that happened in books, and I'm surrounded by books here in my office in New York. History is something that happens to real people in real places. And when we see it that way, when we feel it that way, when we sense it that way, it becomes alive, it becomes meaningful. It's not just a long list of dates and battles and speeches. But most importantly, what I had set out to do 30 years ago, and still hope I'm trying to do, is connect the past with the present. Because that's why we study this in the first place. It's not just to learn what happened 100 or 150 or 400 years ago or 1500 years ago. It's to understand what that has to do with who we are today and what we can learn from those situations. And there is no better circumstance for saying that history matters than the moment that we are in. To talk about a pandemic 100 years ago while we are in the midst of the pandemic of a pandemic is a particularly salient moment. And I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. Just a few words of brief introduction. You've probably heard or read a great deal about the Spanish flu in the last couple of months. The book that I wrote, More Deadly Than War, came out 2 years ago at the time of the 100th anniversary of the flu, and also the end of World War I, because you cannot discuss the flu without discussing the war, and you can't really discuss, especially the last year of the war, without talking about the flu. They are intricately connected in every way. What came to be called the Spanish flu began in the United States. The first recorded accounts took place in army bases that had been set up around the country once the United States declared war, which happened in April of 1917. Of course, the war started in August 1914. The United States stayed out of it for 3 years until April 1917, when war was declared on Germany. At that point, we had no army. We had no navy to speak of. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, put out a call for millions of soldiers to go over and fight in the killing trenches of Europe. This was partly enlistment. I want you, Uncle Sam, that was when he was born, and partly drafting. Right after war was declared, we established a new administration called the Selective Service Administration. They weren't going to call it a draft, and they weren't going to call it conscription. They came up with a nice euphemism: selective service. Oh, you've been selectively selected to serve. So the draft and enlistment started by March of 1918. There were literally hundreds of thousands of young men in army camps spread all across the country. In some of those camps, the first round of a very, very virulent flu started to hit the young soldiers who were in the camps. They were knocked flat on their backs. Some of them were gasping for air, literally choking for air. And because they weren't getting enough oxygen, they were turning blue, a medical condition called cyanosis. And they were sometimes dying right on the spot. Doctors could not believe what they were seeing. In fact, the fact they were turning blue led to the first name of this disease, which was the Purple Death. Before it was called the Spanish flu, a lot of people called it the Purple Death. One doctor in New York City, in fact, later reports that hundreds of people are streaming in. He said they're all blue as huckleberries and spitting blood, because that's what they were doing. Blood was coming from people's ears, eyes, noses, mouths in some cases. So this was a really grotesque and violent sickness, and very often a violent death. It was sudden, it was contagious, and the bodies started to pile up. Those young men in those army camps, and it started to spread around the army camps because people were going back and forth between the camps, then got onto crowded trains. Then they got onto crowded troop ships, and they went to Europe. 1 million doughboys, American soldiers, landed in France by May of 1918, many of them infected with influenza, and it then exploded on the continent. This was the first very, very deadly phase of what became the Spanish flu. This is a good point to explain why it's called the Spanish flu. It did not start in Spain. It did not originate there. Spain was a neutral nation in the war, non-combatant. It did not censor its newspapers, unlike the other warring nations. So the first published report of an outbreak of disease in Europe comes out of Madrid, where the streetcars are shut down and the king gets sick. That's picked up by a British newspaper, and henceforward it would be called, at least in the English-speaking world, the Spanish flu. In Spain, it was called the Naples soldier. The Germans called it the Russian pest. The Russians called it the Chinese fever. So we can see this playing out again today as we give different names to diseases. Now, this had an impact on the war itself, on the conduct of the war. The German army was trying to mount an offensive. They had 500,000 soldiers sick. They were unable to mount an offensive in the spring of 1918 that they hoped would push the British and the French back before the Americans arrived. So it did have an impact on the war. At one point, the British fleet could not sail. It did slack off. Important to remember that as well when we talk about parallels between then and now. It slacked off and then returned in a second wave in September of 1918. It came back more virulent, more violent, more lethal, if anything. And this was when the real deadly aspect of the Spanish flu struck America on the civilian level. Very famously, I've written about this, there was a Liberty Loan Parade. Again, the connection to the war is very powerful. In Philadelphia, 200,000 people crowd into the streets on September 28th. They know that there's virus around. They know that there's flu in the military bases, but the health department allows this parade to go on. Within 2 days of that parade, every hospital bed in Philadelphia was filled. About 15,000 people died in a matter of weeks. The undertakers couldn't keep up with the demand. There were no coffins for all the bodies. People said the bodies are stacked like cordwood. This was the extraordinary moment in American history when people are dying in extraordinary numbers. And just to give you those numbers, 675,000 Americans, it's estimated, died in about a year's time from the Spanish flu and complications. That is more than all the men who died fighting in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and Korea put together. So this was an extraordinary moment in American history. The population, by the way, was about a third of what it is today. So if you just wanted to do some simple math and multiply 700,000 times 3, we'd be getting close in the realm of 2 million people dying from the flu, again, in a very short space of time. So there was no city or town, no family that went unaffected by this. It was an extraordinary moment. The war ends, of course, on November 11th, 1918. The flu continues. Very bad second wave in the fall. It's followed a drop-off, and then another wave comes back in the winter of 1919. One of the victims in 1919 was Woodrow Wilson, who was negotiating the Paris Peace Treaty, what became known as the Versailles Treaty, that ended the war. Wilson was so sick, his doctor thought he had been poisoned, and there were people who wanted to get rid of Wilson, so it was a believable idea, but it was the flu. And there's a suggestion that Wilson's flu really affected it affected his resolve, his judgment, his willpower, perhaps his reasoning, and that he did things that he said he was not going to do before he went to Versailles. Again, that's a little bit of speculation, but interesting to see how this disease might have had an impact on history. And that's one of the real big stories here as well. We tend to talk about history and we teach dates and battles and speeches and causes and pieces of treaty, and we leave out this human piece of the story. But you cannot talk about the war, and especially the last year of the war, without discussing this extraordinary loss of life. 50 to 100 million people dead around the world, the most deadly epidemic in modern history, and the most deadly epidemic in history to get totally since the Black Plague of the Middle Ages. Then it kind of got left out of the history books, which is one of the reasons it's so fascinating, and one of the reasons I called it the hidden history of the Spanish flu. People did not want to talk about it. People did not want to write about it. It was not something that you learned about in school for the next 40 or 50 years when they taught you about World War I. So that's an interesting piece of the story as well. Now, I can tell you that Maine was hit very hard. I can tell you that because Maine was not far from one of the real hotspots of the Spanish flu, which was Boston in 1918. It was the first city that got took the first hit from the second wave in September, especially at a army base just outside of Boston known as Camp Devens. And a lot of people from Maine had sons in Camp Devens, And like all worried parents, they heard their kids were sick and they rushed down there to take care of them. In the process, getting sick and bringing that back. Bath, Portland, big hits to both of those cities. Bath, of course, a naval shipping yard, and the construction of naval vessels. Anywhere there was military activity going on became a focus of what was happening, but then it soon spread into the civilian population. So you have all the debates in 1918 in Maine that we're having today. Should we close churches? Should we shut everything down? Should we do the social distancing? They did call it that. They didn't have flattened the curve back then, but they did all these things and debated all these things very hotly. Perhaps no subject was more important than should we close the churches down? And that really got a lot of pushback in a very different time in America when we were a much more of a church-going nation. So interesting to see how the sociology of this was similar and different in some respects. Maine sent nurses down to Boston. Many of them got sick. Maine sent nurses to Camp Devens. Many of them got sick and died. The Italian immigrants who were in places like Waterville, building the railroads, living in tenements, tremendous impact on those people as well. This was something that certainly hit poorer people worse than it hit the wealthy and the well-to-do. No different from today in many respects. So a lot of similarities between 1918 and today. There are three principal lessons I would like to draw from this, and then I'd like to move on to your questions, and I'm already talking more than I should have. First is the importance in 1918 of lies, censorship, and propaganda. They all played a role in allowing the flu to spread. There were outright lies from people in government about the existence of the flu. They wanted to keep people from panicking. They wanted to make sure that people were going off to the factories and that the kids were going to still go to the camps and enlist to fight in the war. So there was deliberate attempt to censor and even lie about the vaccine. Part of the propaganda was blaming it on the Germans. In Bath, I'm sorry, not Bath, in Bar Harbor, the newspaper said, could this be a new German weapon? They actually believed that the Germans were responsible, that they maybe poisoned the water supplies, or in another case, had Bayer, a German company, tainted aspirin, the wonder drug of the 20th century developed by Bayer. So those things were all in the air at the time. The second thing that's really important, I think, to look back at and learn from is the sense that science was ignored. Certainly in Philadelphia, the health department ignored the advice to not allow this parade to go on. Woodrow Wilson, the president, and Jack Pershing, the head of the expeditionary force, were told by the army doctors not to bring any more men over. Putting men on these ships was spreading the disease. They were only interested in winning the war and the war effort, so they kept pushing soldiers across the ocean on what became floating coffins. And finally, and it relates to that, is the sense of misplaced priorities. The priority for Woodrow Wilson was winning the war. The priority for Philadelphia to have this big parade was meeting its quota of selling war bonds, Liberty loans. So these were economic and political and military concerns that outweighed public health. And we're having that debate right now. So I think it's a really interesting lesson to look back at what happened then, what happened today. Some cities were much more successful than others in preventing tremendous loss. St. Louis and San Francisco were both had very effective quarantine and masking, and we can talk about masks some more. Both of them, however, relaxed too soon, and they saw big spikes of infections and deaths after relaxing their quarantine measures. So again, very important lessons that we can learn from 100 years ago. And on that, I'm going to catch my breath and maybe take some questions from you, Joe.
We do have one question that might give you an opportunity to kind of just build on a little bit where you ended. Aaron Kate's saying, I'm looking to make connections to coronavirus and what's happening for students to draw upon modern day connections. And I think your kind of 3 points there at the end kind of hit on that. So I don't know if that's something you wanted to speak to more because of that question. Hold on, I gotta find you again. There you go.
Okay, I'm unmuted. My wife would probably like that button. The fact is that there are a lot of parallels and a lot of things that we can look back on. I should first of all say there are a lot of differences too. When I wrote this book 2 years ago, everybody asked me, can this happen again? And I said, of course it can happen again. I didn't foresee it happening again quickly and the way it's played out. But certainly an awful lot of people have been worried about the return of pandemic virus or some other disease. That's why Ebola really scared a lot of people a few years ago. And we erected some very, very profound international guardrails to help protect not only the United States, but people around the world from another pandemic. Unfortunately, some of those guardrails have been lowered in the past few years, and that's something else we can talk about. But there are some key differences that we should start off with first. 100 years ago, they didn't know what a virus was. They had never seen a virus. Viruses are infinitely smaller than bacteria, which had been seen. So these doctors, with the tools that they had, the microscopes of the day, were looking for a bacterial infection, and it just wasn't there. They were trying to come up with a vaccine that was a bacterial-based vaccine, and it had no use. They couldn't fight a virus that they couldn't see, and that's one of the most important things we understand now. We know what viruses are. We even know what the Spanish flu virus was. Spanish flu was flu. It was an influenza virus. What we are living with now is called coronavirus, a different type of virus, a virus nonetheless, and a very, very dangerous one. It does not seem to be right now as lethal and as sudden a killer as the Spanish flu was. The other big difference, and I'm careful, a little bit careful about saying anything too medically here about the current virus, but in 1918, I can say with certainty, what was unusual is that this flu was killing otherwise healthy young people, soldiers going into the camps, nurses, young women who were becoming nurses, doctors were falling very, very quickly. It did not kill the very old and the very young as flu typically does. It's one of the interesting aspects of the Spanish flu. But there are some other things that we can say are similar. First of all, the way you control it in 1918 is exactly the way you can control it today. Hand washing. For 2 years, I've been telling kids when I go around school to talk about this book, I would end every lecture with 2 words, hand washing. It was true then, it's true today. Masking, we're having this debate, and we've been playing this debate out in this country. Masks were the iconic image of the Spanish flu. You can see from the book, these are 2 newsboys wearing masks. The typical mask of 1918 was made from gauze. Gauze, of course, is not very thick, has a lot of holes in it, not very effective for keeping out virus. Also, people were supposed to clean them. You were supposed to use them very carefully, and most people did not do that. So the flu mask in 1918, for the most part, was a very ineffective means of controlling the virus. Much better, as we still know today, for keeping an infected person from infecting other people rather than preventing you from getting infected. So that's one of the things that was true then and somewhat true today. The response of certain cities, I think, is a straw. I mentioned it briefly, but let me go into it a little bit more. We're having this debate right now about reopening the economy, opening up cities. What makes sense? This is a really important and old debate that goes far beyond this particular outbreak and this particular pandemic, and really gets to what a society values most. In 1918, the most important thing was, to the government at least, was continuing the fight against the Germans, continuing to send people into factories, continuing to train troops and putting them on ships and taking them overseas. So I think for students today, the parallels between the two things are pretty easy to see. And we've also had, the last thing I mentioned earlier was also this sense of ignoring science. This is also a much bigger issue to me than this crisis alone, because we are working under an administration and living under an administration that has been really ignoring science. There's really no other way to code it. Whether it's in environmental questions, questions of air, water, all of those things, and certainly the question of climate change, which is, in the background here, we're focused on this crisis, but we do still have the enormous crisis of climate change, which this administration has chosen to essentially ignore. So I think that those are really important issues that go beyond the crisis that we're in, but certainly affect it. We should really be listening to the best scientists and the best science that we have at any given moment. And I don't think that has been the case. There's a really wonderful article in the New Yorker, current New Yorker magazine, which is about why Seattle did so well in controlling this as opposed to New York. And it really walks through the different things that Seattle and Washington State did to tamp down and flatten the curve very early on. And they were fortunate to have had somebody who was trained in the CDC, and there's an epidemiological investigation service, and he had been trained in that. And so as soon as he saw this first case, he said, not immediately, but he told the mayor, and then the governor, that they were going to have to soon move towards shutting things down, which they did. A real forward-thinking approach that was led by science, and in which the scientists became the spokespeople. That's certainly not what is happening today with these press briefings that we're getting from the administration's task force, where the voice of science is not the first and most important voice that you hear. So that's some overall general depictions of how we should have learned some lessons from 100 years ago and how they may or may not be applied today.
Ken, I'm trying to get ahead of the game. I'm knowing I'm going to have to unmute you here in a second, Ken. There's a question about, and I lost the question. Any idea where, like, the current stage of COVID-19, is there a comparable stage to the Spanish flu of 1918, kind of in terms of where we're at now and what that looked like then?
Yes, I'm unmuted. That's a really good question and a little bit harder to answer. I think that the timing in many ways is similar, because the Spanish flu, as I mentioned earlier, really began in February, March of 1918, very similar to what we're seeing having happened with COVID-19, although they keep kind of pushing back the date of when this appeared. And I know a lot of people are asking, was it here much earlier than we thought? And that's a scientific question that remains to be answered. So I'm trying to be very careful about the scientific medical aspects of this current crisis, because I am not a doctor or a medical expert in any respect. I'm really speaking this from a historical basis. The Spanish flu, when it made its first appearance, was typical of flu season in the United States. February, March, April, it accelerated, started to slack off. It was around other parts of the world at that time, but many people thought, well, this is the flu, and it will be over with flu season. It was also much less lethal in that first phase. It was killing a lot of people, but not quite as violently or virulently as it would later on. So that is another important lesson, and where nobody knows if this COVID is going to make a resurface in September. Dr. Fauci was warning about it, exactly that, the other day, and said, we don't know, but he expects it to. The difference of what happened in 1918, and we can't say what will happen in September of 2020. In 1918, the virus came back, and it seems to have mutated to some degree. So what happens when something mutates is that it can become more violent and virulent, or it could become less violent. And this one became more virulent. And it also mutated enough so that some people who might have been exposed to it in the springtime, and developed what we call that herd immunity, so that you might get a little touch of it and then not get it again. That did not seem to apply to Spanish flu, that it had mutated enough sufficiently by the following fall that it was almost like a different and new disease, and many, many people got it. The infection rate was very high, and the contagion level was very high. So it's, again, no one can predict what will happen in terms of this virus and its impact come fall. I can only hope that we will not have a repeat of what happened in 1918, because as I've been saying, it was much worse in the fall than it was in the springtime. And I'd hate to have that be the historic parallel that comes true again. But we should be very, very cognizant that this is not something that just goes away in April or May with the summertime coming, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. I don't think that the history suggests that, and most scientists that I'm reading about this don't suggest it either.
Ken, Wendy wants to know, and this is the last question I currently have in the hopper, so if you've got some other questions, please feel free to put it in the chat box. Wendy wants to know, do you know if there was equity in treatment, equity in the availability of treatment and access to hospitals for those who were sick in 1918? And let me find you, there you are.
Good question. Let me talk a little bit about what America looked like in 1918, because it was very different from our America. First of all, it was still primarily a rural country. More people lived outside of cities than lived in cities in 1918. More than half the population was still rural and agricultural. So most people did not live near a hospital. Hospitals were in big cities for the most part. New York City, obviously. Philadelphia had quite a few hospitals as a university city with teaching hospitals. Johns Hopkins had just opened a few years before. So hospitals were primarily something that existed in big cities. And I should also say, this gets a little bit into the history of hospitals a little far afoot, but hospitals were really built and developed to take care of poor people, because rich people didn't go to the hospital. Rich people had a doctor come and take care of them. So the whole notion of hospital was really a kind of creation of the idea of public health, especially in bigger cities, especially in cities with large immigrant populations. So that's an interesting aspect of how hospitals grew up in this country. I should also mention that being a doctor in 1918 was very different from what we think of a doctor today in terms of the education and the training and the apprenticeship, the internship. That whole long process that people go through today was not the case. Back then, if you went to Harvard Medical School, for instance, they had, I think, a dozen microscopes, and they didn't do autopsies. They didn't do dissection. They basically listened to lectures. So medical practice was very different. There were many, many fewer doctors for most people in 1918. Again, they would have been primarily in large cities. And the other thing was, again, the impact of the war. A lot of doctors, as once the war began for the United States, were pulled into the Army. The Army needed an enormous number of doctors and nurses, and that's another aspect of this, to treat all the soldiers who were going to be either sick or wounded in battle. So at the worst possible moment in American history in terms of a pandemic, you have the fewest number of doctors available, perhaps in history. Once again, this real close connection between war and the flu. So for most people outside of a big city, there was no hospital to get to. That didn't necessarily mean it was the worst possible thing, because hospitals couldn't do too much for you anyway. There were really no treatments for this influenza. Most doctors said, bed rest, liquids, fresh air were the things, and just stay comfortable, stay hydrated. It's pretty much the advice a lot of people have been getting today about this situation. So just having hospitals nearby wasn't necessarily the best thing, and in fact, crowded hospitals became their own generators of the disease. But there's one aspect of this that you didn't ask that I'm going to spin out a little bit. That's the racial component of hospitals at that time and the treatment of patients. Because Jim Crow was alive and well in America in 1918, and not just in the Deep South, throughout the country. So people who were African American in Philadelphia, which was a somewhat progressive city, the hospitals are segregated. If you went into the hospital with Spanish flu, there was going to be a ward for the Black community, and it probably wasn't going to be in a very nice place. There were actually a few African-American doctors who had started their own hospitals. The African-American community, and the research on this is shifting a little bit. It was thought right afterwards and for a long time that it did not suffer the same degree of mortality, kind of the opposite of what we're seeing right now, that the general population did. And some people think that that might have been the fact that segregation actually kept the African-American community quarantined from the wider world, and they were less prone to get the disease, or that they might have been exposed to the earlier bout of Spanish flu and been immunized against it. Nobody's really quite sure about that one. And the other part of that is that the record keeping was so poor. We don't really know what the mortality rates by race were in 1918. But clearly, Jim Crow existed. There were women, African-American women who wanted to become nurses. They did become nurses. The Army wouldn't let them treat white patients until they needed to. At a certain point, of course, the flu was so bad that they were allowing white soldiers to be seen by Black nurses, which at a certain point in this country would have been unthinkable. So that actually was a piece of the social change that the Spanish flu brought about. But it's a really good question, but it also kind of speaks to America being a very different place in 1918 than it was today. And to finish that point, I would just say that the federal government, as we think of it, didn't exist in 1918. Most Americans had one connection to the federal government, at the time. They got their mail delivered, the post office, which is again in the news. But there was no big public health arm of the federal government. There was no CDC. There was no National Institute of Health. There was a US Public Health Service. These are the guys who you see in the old pictures of Ellis Island in uniforms, who would check the immigrants as they were coming in to see if they weren't, if they needed to be quarantined and not allowed in. The US Public Health Service really also got caught up in the war effort. They began to train doctors and nurses specifically for the Army. So there was no federal response to the pandemic in 1918. It was really left up to localities to do it. Congress authorized some money for the cities, but that was about it. And beyond that, they were issuing a lot of pamphlets about, cover your cough, don't sneeze, spit spreads death, but very little in a practical sense to prevent this, because again, the war effort was all that the federal government was aimed at. I hope that answers that question. It's a good one.
Thank you, Ken, for going there. I was actually going to bring up, if you didn't, because I heard you with the NCSS lecture part. I found that part fascinating about the idea of the federal government was just such a completely different component, in the minds of the people. I think that that's hard for us to kind of make that connection, given the fact that we see like these nightly briefings and, there's so much reliance on that now. So I'm glad you talked about that. And I'm wondering, go ahead.
Just to put a little historical footnote to that, one of the governors who was trying desperately to get more help from the United States, the federal government, he was actually the lieutenant governor in Massachusetts at the time. His name was Calvin Coolidge. And we think of Calvin Coolidge as this, apostle of republicanism, small government, self-reliance. But during the 1918 pandemic, Governor Calvin Coolidge was desperate to get help from the federal government to his state, and there was very little coming. Just an interesting little footnote to that piece of it.
Well, I'm wondering if you want to make the jump then from historical federal roles. There is a question. What would your advice be to as to the opening up of states and or the country and for schools in the fall?
Again, I'm not going to offer too much medical scientific advice here. I'm following the advice that I'm seeing written and talked about. But my chief advice as a parallel to the past would be, again, to say, let science lead the way, let the data lead the way. I don't know if any of you have been tuned into the governor. I'm in New York, and the governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, has been on television every day talking about the New York response to this crisis. And New York has obviously been the epicenter in of the outbreak in the United States. And this has been his mantra every day. He's being led by the data. He's being led by the science. He's not doing anything on his gut. He's not doing anything because he thinks it will be a good idea. He's letting the scientists lead the way and saying, this is what you have to do until this. I read the same, things that you read about how we can get to the place where we can reopen schools, reopen society. And it's going to be a challenge. There's no question about it. Everyone I read says the same thing. We need to be at a place where we can do much more testing so that we can know who is positive, who's carrying this, and then we can isolate them. Because if we can't start isolating those who are sick from those who are not sick, it will continue to spread. And so that's the key piece of information and advice that I hear and see really every day. This is how, for instance, Germany, there was an interesting piece in the New York Times the other day about how Germany was so successful in terms of keeping its death rate so much lower than not only the United States, but other European countries. And they say testing, they would go in, test people, and they were testing very widely and very broadly, and then isolate people who they found to be positive. So they weren't getting this big hit of spread. Clearly, we're going to have to maintain so much of the social distance until we get to that point where, and obviously a vaccine or other treatments are going to have to play a role in this, so that if people get sick and we have some way to treat them, that will be good. And that's, you know, playing out every day in the newspapers. So I'm not any clearer on what's going to happen come the fall than many of you are. I know that we are in a different reality. The fact that we're having this conversation on Zoom is part of that reality, and you're, I'm sure, teaching your classes in a different way. And I've always been so admiring of what you guys do as teachers, as professionals, as educators. And my admiration for your dedication and passion has only, you know, gone up, because I see how hard teachers, when I look at SS Chat on Twitter or I talk to teachers around the country, you guys are so passionately dedicated, not just to, you know, getting the job done right, but making sure your students are really properly taken care of, and that you're providing them what you need. So I thank you for that. I can see what's going on, and I know how teachers are struggling in this circumstance. So I think this whole society is going to have to, you know, rejigger a little bit away from what was normal. There's not going to be going back to what we had before. NPR had a story the other day about what schools will look like in September, and look, they said no assemblies or sports. It's hard to imagine school without assemblies or sports. I saw a classroom in China the other day, preschool classroom. It was really interesting because each child had hats on, and then they had on the top of a hat like this thing that came out maybe 18 inches on each side, and that was supposed to be how far they were to be away from the nearest other child. And apparently this was something that was done in imperial China to keep people from whispering to each other, that you couldn't lean in to talk to somebody because you had this thing on the side of your hat. And they're doing the same thing with children in classrooms. So I don't know if we're going to have children with hats that have, you know, tinfoil hats with, you know, yardsticks on them. But I've seen a classroom in Korea recently that each desk had a plastic partition all the way around it. You know, is that where we're going to be in September? I don't know, but we're certainly not going back to what we had last September. I think we're all reasonably certain of that, and that's the best. You know, the history is very, very good for looking at the past and saying what happened and what we can learn from it. It's less good as a crystal ball in terms of how life is going to change. I just don't think that any of us know yet, but it's going to not be what we have lived with for a long time. I'm sorry, that's pretty pessimistic.
Do you feel like you have time for one more question that's kind of related to that?
Sure.
So Clayton asked the question that you had talked about the United States was a lot more rural back then, yet that was kind of nullified by the recruitment of soldiers, right? So that still led to that. Thinking about, you'd kind of talked a little bit about some of the communication with Zoom, thinking about how travel and communication is now being done in 2020, looking at some of those things, how do you think that might affect ours? Like back then it was rural, but we had recruitment. What might this kind of look out in that historical lens?
Interesting and good point. Yeah, it was very rural, but again, it's the war. It's the impact of the war. There's a reason it was called a world war, because the whole world was involved, and there were ships going from the United States to Europe, and then ships from Europe were going to every port in the world to collect the resources of the world. And every time one of those ships with an infected crew stopped in a place like Bombay, now Mumbai, India, or Johannesburg, South Africa, or ports in Africa, or Odessa in Russia. It was almost instantaneous, the explosion of flu when a ship hit one of these deep water ports. Same thing when they went down to the South Pacific. There's a story of one island that I talk about in More Deadly Than War, where a ship with an infected crew landed, and 25%, not of the people who were infected, but 25% of the population on the island died in a matter of weeks, partly because they had never been exposed to any kind of influenza, and so they were a really ripe community. So globalization on a massive scale happened during World War I, and that's one of the reasons it became a pandemic. Obviously, today we have globalization on a massive scale because of the way our economies work, and the fact that we can get on an airplane with 300 or 400 other people, and we can be anywhere in the world in the matter of a few hours. So that kind of level of communication, transportation, the interconnectedness of economies has completely changed the ball game for America. And the other thing that's obvious here is that there's no walls to keep out a virus. Viruses don't respect borders. They don't carry passports. They're no respecter of race, nationality, creed, color. Viruses look for a place to climb on and reproduce themselves. That's what viruses exist for, to be a virus and to make more viruses. So the changes in the economy worldwide are what really are the focus of this of the new reality in terms of pandemics. And that's why this has to be an international reaction, and it has to rely upon international cooperation. We started to develop that right after the Spanish flu. In fact, there was no United Nations then, of course, and even the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson's ideal of creating a world body, fell apart. But it was the beginning of an international health organization that began to share much more information about science and medicine around the world. We have done that in the past 30 years. But as I mentioned earlier on, clearly some of those guardrails have been knocked down, perhaps deliberately by this administration, perhaps some of them just the result of budget cutting, some of them also the result of the xenophobia that exists. So when it comes to pandemics, we have to remember the pan means it's the whole world, it's universal, and we can't think about protecting ourselves without thinking what is going on the other side of the world. A long time ago, I shouldn't say that long ago, but when we had Ebola, other cases, SARS, these other outbreaks in the past 10 or 15 years, there was an effort to say we have to see this coming when it's starting and not wait for it to get here. In this case, we waited for it to get here, and once you do that, you've waited too long. So I think that's my concern is that we have to have a real serious conversation about how we are going to protect the health of Americans in an increasingly globalized world if we take these attitudes of go it alone and not cooperate with international bodies like the World Health Organization. Are they perfect? Have they done everything right? I don't think so, but we have to make sure that we can get the cooperation that we need internationally, because this is not a go it alone, America first kind of problem.
Well, Ken, on behalf of all the participants and educators here in Maine, thank you for your time, for your expertise, for your passion about this topic, and being willing to kind of take the questions and run. I think this is the third or fourth time I've heard some version of this, and I still find it fascinating to hear the different takes on that. I know that you are not keeping an eye on the chat room, but there's a lot of thank yous coming through and how much people have enjoyed themselves. So I want to
Yeah, I'll jump in. I don't know how much time I have. I want to just thank everyone. I don't know what that was, but I want to thank everyone who has come. And again, thank you for what you do. This is a pleasure for me. I have a soul connection to Maine. Probably some of you I've talked to this about this to you, but we have 2 grandchildren who are in Belfast at the moment, and we miss them sorely, and we can't see them. So I will be back eventually to Maine to visit my family there, and I do have a deep and warm connection to the state, and you've always been so welcoming when I come there. So I thank you for that. Second thing I wanted to point out is that I love to do this in a classroom. So go to don'tknowmuch.com. There's a button there that says classroom Skypes or classroom visits. I am doing a limited number of classroom visits, and I do them for Zoom, with Zoom or Skype or whatever other platforms exist. And I really like to do that. And lastly, I should mention that there's another book coming. This one is called Strongman: The Rise of 5 Dictators and the Fall of Democracy, and it will be published in October. And it's about the other virus that we have not been talking about too much because we've been preoccupied. And that's the virus of authoritarianism. And that virus can kill democracy. And I fear that democracy is under assault around the world, and certainly to some degree in this country. And that's why I wrote this book. It's the story of the five of the most deadly dictators in history. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Saddam Hussein, how they came to power, how they bent entire nations to their will, and the extraordinary loss and death and war and privation that these men brought upon their nations and the rest of the world. It's a really important story, I think, for our time, and I'll look forward to talking to all about that come the fall when we're back in some kind of school. So thank you, Joe, also for your help in putting this together. I watch what you do on SS Chat and your feed, and it's remarkable. So thank you all for what you do, and especially you, Joe.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Real quick, last second for everybody, I have put your feedback and contact our survey link into the chat box. Ken, if there's any last questions before I stop the recording, or last comments before I stop the recording?
Just one I mentioned to you before we started. There is a set of videos that I've done with Jess Ellison of the Minnesota Historical Society and the Minnesota Social Studies Conference. There are 4 short videos called More Deadly Than War, and they're really meant for teachers to help shape classroom lessons around the Spanish flu, with some resources, some links, and even some ideas for classroom activities. So you can find that under More Deadly Than War or at the Minnesota Historical Society.
And I'm going to go ahead and put a link. When I put the video up, I will link to that session as well. And a minor little segue, then I'm also happy to announce that on May 14th, the same Jessica Ellison that he's referring to has agreed to do a webinar for us called Working Toward a Culturally Relevant Classroom. Jessica is an amazing educator, both in Minnesota and the national level. So she's going to be joining us. So a good segue into Jessica as well. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you, Ken. If you need anything, please let me know.